that, because if I get a virus, I'm sharing it with everybody else. Or if my system gets hacked, I do have Joanna's number on my phone. And that makes her vulnerable. So we all have to take this seriously in terms of safety for journalists, and not just journalists, sources, because you're nothing as a journalist, having been a journalist for a long time, you're nothing as a journalist without a good source. And it's our responsibility as journalists to protect our sources. The next in my defendate word is legal defence, and that means, and we've heard about people talking a bit about it already today, but that is about when journalists get locked up under these new laws, we need to provide defence for them. As a community, we need to help and collaborate and get around these people to ensure that, you know, they're protected to the best of the best legal defence they can get. And I know this happens in all of your countries. Quite often journalists get locked up, and if no one picks them up from the legal community, they get locked up for the wrong reasons. They should be able to get off by a proper legal defence, but they don't. And then the last one is, and it relates to the law as well, we need to hold our governments to account in terms of the way they change the laws. We need to make sure what they do is constitutional. We need to make sure that every bit of rigour that we can place on them is placed on them, so that when they change the law that suppresses press freedom, it is within their constitutional right to do so. And I can talk about Indonesia. There were examples where the government took actions and later got kicked out in the courts because there was overreach. And I think that could be applied to a number of countries. I might stop there so we can ask more questions later.
Thanks, Rowan. I especially liked the bit about everybody has to be responsible on digital security and safety. It's a collective cause, which is definitely, agree with that. All right, I'm going to pass the mic over to Felicity. Before I do so, I just want to double check if everyone can hear me clearly online and offline. Yes, great, thank you. Okay, Felicity, you're good to go.
Thank you very much, Darnie, for the introduction. I did actually prepare slides, which I don't know if it can be pulled up. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So I hope that everybody is still in high spirits after their lunch. I'm going to focus my presentation mostly on Thailand, because that is where Manusha Foundation currently operates to a large extent. And I personally do not have any background in journalism. And so I'm going to focus on what type of laws or policies that are currently in place in Thailand that have impacted how media workers conduct their work in the country. Let me just preface this by recalling what William from New Narrative said this morning, which I believe is very important and very relevant to my presentation. He said that right now we have, for instance, press freedom indices online that pretty much sums up countries' performance or success or lack of success in preserving press freedom in each of their jurisdictions. However, the problem with this indices is that sometimes they don't quite capture the interconnectedness between press freedom and other civil liberties, such as the right to free speech online, or the right not to be subjected to disproportionate or unchecked surveillance. And Thailand is a very good illustration of this, because if we look at the World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders, in the past 3 years, Thailand has actually climbed up the rank. But as I'm going to demonstrate later, this is actually not an accurate representation of what's been going on in the country, especially in the past 3 years or so. So if it could go to the next slide. After that as well. Keep going. I'm going to skip over a lot of these slides because I think we don't have enough time to cover everything. Of course, we'll be happy to address questions related to them later. Next. Okay, so let's forget about the other countries. I did make summaries for every country in Southeast Asia, but I'm gonna focus on Thailand. So a little bit of context on Thai politics. Right now, the country is led by military hardliner and royalist Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. He took power in 2014 by means of a coup d'etat. He's currently also serving concurrently as Thailand's Minister of Defense, which is already problematic in itself. His administration is known to have leveled a multitude of attacks against journalists, academics, human rights defenders in the country. And so press freedom has definitely deteriorated a lot under his governance. He is also known to have attacked regular citizens who expressed dissent either online or offline in regards to his governance. So next. Okay, so in Thailand, there are a lot of laws that have had an adverse impact on press freedom. So many, in fact, that I don't think I'd be able to condense everything into a 10-minute introductory remark. But I'm gonna try my best. So number one, Thailand has what is known as the 2007 Computer Crime Act, which was amended in 2016. This act criminalizes anybody that spreads false or distorted information or information that threatens the national security of Thailand. It carries a maximum prison term of 15 years, in addition to fines that could go up to 300,000 baht, which is roughly the equivalent of 8,000 US dollars. This is, of course, an exorbitant amount if we consider that the average Thai citizen earns around 400 to 500 USD per month. And then after that, we also have Section 112 of the Criminal Code, also known as the Royal Defamation or the Lèse-majesté law. Similar to the CCA, this law carries a maximum prison term of 15 years. It is known as the harshest royal defamation law in the world to date. And something interesting about the Royal Defamation Law of Thailand is that it became subject to a de facto moratorium back in 2018. And then it stayed that way until 2020 when the government revived it. Since then, there have been more than 200 people either charged or convicted under the law. And these, of course, include journalists. The latest example would be from March of this year, where 2 citizen journalists were arrested and subsequently charged with lèse-majesté for simply live broadcasting an event in Bangkok where activists conducted a poll to see if people had been bothered by the Thai royal motorcades. These people were also charged with Section 116 of the Criminal Code. So the slide is not moving, but it's actually there. Section 116 is it governs the offense of sedition. So anybody that causes unrest or disaffection amongst Thai people, or causes people to defy the laws of Thailand could be subjected to this law. And Section 116 was used as a filler law during the 2-year period when Section 112 was not applied. And then other than that, there's also, Thailand has another law, and this is fairly recent. It's from 2019. It has the Cybersecurity Act. It essentially empowers authorities to surveil online activities on various grounds, including public security and public order and national security. It also empowers governments to basically ask anybody to hand over user data or hand over their equipments in case of a reasonable cause that a cybercrime has been, reasonable cause to suspect that a cybercrime has been committed. This next law is even more explicit in terms of the Thai government's intention to really restrict media freedom in the country. So right now, the Thai parliament is discussing what is known as the Draft Media Ethics and Professional Standards bill. It requires all media outlets in the country to register with a newly established media council. And this media council is also in charge of developing a set of media ethics principles and take action against anybody that fails to comply with the ethical standards. So of course now this begs the question of what happens to unregistered news organizations. Does that mean that they would just simply be banned in the country? What happens to citizen journalists who of course do not fall under the umbrella of formal media and might therefore not be eligible for to get a license? As I said, the bill is currently still in discussion. We don't know when it's going to be passed, but seeing the intensity in which digital repression in Thailand has been happening, there's a pretty good chance that this law will be passed quite soon. So lastly, there's also the draft regulation on prevention, suppression, and solving the problem of fake news. This is specifically intended to solve the issue of fake news online. It prescribes inappropriate content that, again, may cause damage to the peace and security of Thailand. So we hear a lot of these phrases. In each of this instrument, there's always a reference to public order, national security. The bottom line is that we simply have no way of knowing or predicting how these phrases or preconditions to convicting someone would be interpreted by the authorities in charge of enforcing these laws. And that's exactly where the problem lies. We simply cannot know who can be subjected to these laws and who cannot, because the government basically has full powers to decide that unilaterally. Aside from these national legislation, there's also the question of whether or not media workers enjoy sufficient constitutional protection in Thailand. The answer is, well, the Thai constitution does contain a provision saying that media workers deserve the right to enjoy this. However, in reality, it's been very much inconsistently applied. So in the early stages of unrest in Thailand, pro-democracy unrest, the Thai government decided to ban some major media outlets in the country. So the list includes Voice TV, Prachatai as well. We have a representative of Prachatai here actually at the event. And these groups were banned because they were generating news on pro-democracy protests. And then not even a week later, this was in October 2019, by the way, and I'm going to be restricting my discussion in the past 3-year period, because this is where we've seen a really, really large spike in cases of digital rights abuse. So not even a week later, this ban by the government was lifted by the Constitutional Court, who said that the Thai Constitution does protect media workers, and the closure of entire mass media organizations on the basis that were cited by the Thai government were simply not permitted. But the story didn't end there, because fast forward 2 years later in 2021, the Constitutional Court all of a sudden said that any calls for reform, government reform in the country, constitutes an attempt to overthrow a monarchy, meaning that anybody that partakes in pro-democracy protests or calls to reform the Thai monarchy are considered to be treasonous. So they are also ordered to cease all activities in this respect. When this ruling came out, the consequence is that media organizations were also prevented or prohibited from covering those movements, because now if they do so, they will be considered as complicit, sort of, in these so-called attempts at overthrowing monarchy. I can go on and on about, I know that I'm running out of time. I can go on and on about all of the other policies and mechanisms put in place by the Thai government that really has jeopardized journalism in the country. And I will probably leave this to the questions that might be asked by either Danny or the audience later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Felicity. Yeah, I think you brought up a really important point about the extensive numbers of laws that are used by governments to mitigate online surveillance and digital authoritarianism. But like you said, we can't really use these laws, no matter how good the intention is, because at the end of the day, we have no way of knowing how the authorities who implement these laws are going to interpret them. So that is a really good point. All right, Mikkel, you can go next.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
afternoon, everyone. In line of what we've been hearing, what's happening in the Philippines, what's happening in Thailand, what's happening here in Cambodia, where I've been working for the past 3 years in the UNESCO office, is nothing different from what is happening in other places in the world, unfortunately. I'm going to reference again the Global Trends report that UNESCO just released last year, which was already mentioned by my colleague from Bangkok office. According to this report, in the last 5 years, a total of 57 laws have been adopted or amended globally that potentially can disturb or harm freedom of expression online. This report was launched in 2021. As of today, there are in the making over 100 pieces of legislation, policies, or amendments globally that have the potential to reduce, limit freedom of expression. Over 100 are in the making. Obviously, we can also link this situation with what we just lived. A couple of years ago, COVID-19 became the perfect excuse for many governments to do something that maybe they wanted to do before, which was having more control over the media and the information ecosystem globally. Also, we have witnessed in the last 5 years more severe limitations in freedom of expression, like internet shutdowns. The most, the longest one in the world is the one that unfortunately our colleagues, neighbors from Myanmar are experiencing. Even before the coup, there was a whole region that was shut down, and still until today, areas of the country are in a complete internet blackout. So UNESCO recorded 213 unique incidents of internet shutdowns globally, which is double of what happened in the previous report that covered the previous 5-year period. This also, of course, tells us how the way we consume information, share information has changed. As the internet becomes a more like bigger part of our lives, and it becomes our primary source of consuming, sharing information, these limitations are as well increasing. Also, we are seeing how private companies are getting more closely scrutinized, because we are also realizing from UNESCO and globally many countries are realizing the importance that internet companies really play in the way we interact with each other, share information, and are starting to demand a certain level of accountability. So this is another development as well recorded in this report. There are also positive trends, just to put a bit of light in this very dark context, which is that there are more and more countries who are passing access to information legislation. In the last 5 years, 22 countries have passed access to information legislation. We have to remember as well that access to information is included in the Sustainable Development Goals, as my colleague said earlier this morning as well. It's under the Sustainable SDG 16 that you all know, where access to information is one of the targets. That's why many countries also are accelerating their efforts. Many countries are accelerating their efforts in this regard. We are seeing, I had a few more numbers that I wanted to mention from this report, also linked to the safety of journalists. Obviously, surveillance has become a major issue of concern. I think that in the region, in the Philippines, we are witnessing some of the most aggressive and smart, maybe, like also Rowan said, very impressive strategy that the previous government followed. But we are seeing quite impressive well-thought strategies to attack journalists. Although we have been witnessing less and less killings of journalists globally, in parallel, we are seeing this increasing number of other tactics of harassment and attacks on journalists, especially through the internet. It's worth mentioning as well online harassment. There is this data, very scary and worrisome piece of data that almost 80% of women journalists have experienced some sort of harassment online. So obviously the online sphere has become like another battlefield for journalists, and an area where maybe many journalists and media houses were unprepared for the threats that were coming to them. And well, I could continue referencing this report for longer and providing some numbers. The reason why I keep referring to this report, and my colleagues here in Cambodia, they will be thinking like, you bring up this report again and again. But I think it is important for all of us to really understand that these challenges are global. Of course, this region has very specific features and characteristics, and the impact is different, but it really tells us which are the priorities, not only for you, all the journalists associations, organizations, and organizations working on press freedom or human rights in the region. Also for intergovernmental organizations like us, like UNESCO and the UN, this data is really what tells us which are the priorities and where we should target our actions. And the same thing happens as well for the donor countries, where they look at these reports to strategize better how to invest development aid funding. Can you hear me clearly? It looks like I pick all the wrong microphones. And in this context, it's really important as well to understand that the media landscape is changing. And the role of journalists, although it is still the same, the perception from the public has completely changed. That is why in the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration that was adopted in the World Press Freedom Day in 2021, the title was Journalism for a Public Good. And building trust in the media was included as one of the main priorities in this declaration adopted by journalists from around the world, member states, academia. Because really what we are seeing today, why disinformation is spreading more than ever before, why many governments are having it so easy, we can say, when it comes to silencing the media, is really because the trust in the media has diminished. We have seen this especially during COVID-19. All this red tagging that we hear that happens in the Philippines. We have heard more than one country leader really blaming journalists for spreading disinformation, for creating confusion. All these public statements from authorities, all this paranoia that was created during COVID-19, where people will trust more their Facebook friends than the journalists, have really contributed to harm this trust that the people, the public, have in journalism. I mean, I was trying to find an article that I read a couple of years ago. I'm from Spain. We had a 40 years dictatorship that ended in 1979. A few years after, they did a survey. They asked Spanish people which are the 3 jobs, professions that they consider the most venerable ones, the ones that they admire the most. Well, in these top 3, the professions that people estimated the most were medical doctors, school teachers, and journalists. Because people really believe that thanks to journalism and media, that helped in the transition towards democracy. Today, Spain is is considered a mature democracy. So people really believed at that time that thanks to journalism, we could build these very strong institutions that allow us to have a healthy democracy. This article compared this information with another similar survey conducted just in the early 2010s, sorry. There, in the top 20, I can tell you that journalists are nowhere to be found. So this is a reflection for all of us. Why people don't have this trust that they used to have in journalism. I think that for all of us here, for all of you colleagues who work in journalist associations, etc., there is a big task, a very important job for all of us to do to explain the public why journalism is very important. There is a need for a bit of meta-journalism, meta-media, explaining to the people what is the job that journalists really do. When all these pieces of legislation are passed by different governments, of course it is a scandal for those who work in the media sector, but the general public might not really understand them. They might not think that this is something that affects them, that this is something that affects their right to freedom of expression. And we have to remember that freedom of expression is not only the right to share information, it's also the right to seek information, to receive information. And I think that more effort needs to be done in explaining to the public that these pieces of legislation not only affect journalists, but because they affect journalists, they also affect their rights. And I think that is really important. It's a media literacy kind of task job that media professionals have the big responsibility to do. And I think that, of course, this is more long term. People will not realize from one day to the other about these issues, but it's an area where we really put efforts. And when it comes to the legislation of the internet, I think that our colleague Michael might go more on detail on that. Of course, whenever it comes to regulating information, the basic rule is that, yes, there are limits to freedom of expression, as we all know. It's not an absolute right, but every limitation that is imposed in freedom of expression has always to be the least intrusive one. And it has to be done in a proportional way. The same rule that applies to the offline free speech applies as well to the online freedom of expression. That's why many of these pieces of legislation are absolutely unnecessary if the law that already exists in the different legislative frameworks is already well defined and clear. I will just end by mentioning a pretty important upcoming event that UNESCO is convening in February next year. For the first time, the UN is organizing a conference to address the issue on how do we regulate internet platforms. It is the first time that academia, international organizations, journalists, as well as governments will be coming together to design, to come up with some principles for the possible legislation that can be applied to the online platforms without limiting freedom of expression, access to information. So I think I will end here and happy to answer more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikel. You've made some really remarkable points just now, but one that stood out for me was online being another battlefield for journalists. And also the trust deficit for journalism. Yeah, I guess it is a responsibility, a collective responsibility to sort of, I don't know, is it to gain it back or is it to just bring more awareness? Anyway, we will be passing on to Michael, who will be presenting his opening remarks online, virtually. On to you, Michael.
Thank you. Can you see the slide presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thank you again. My name is Michael Castor. As she mentioned, the organization I work with is Article 19. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, we're a global freedom of expression organization. And specifically, the role that I play at Article 19 is leading on our regional work related to internet freedom and digital rights. So a lot of what we do, obviously, is also in support of the media, but not exclusively. We work in various other elements as well. Trying to get my slide. Here we go. So keeping in mind the title of this session, I wanted to take a step back first and talk a little bit about digital authoritarianism more broadly before specifically looking at some of the elements where it relates to surveillance. Surveillance obviously is one of the key tactics or tools used within the digital authoritarian toolkit. But I would say that the others are censorship, network interference, computational propaganda, which is sort of a broad term to encapsulate everything from mis and disinformation to automated attacks, influence operations and so forth. And finally, the targeted persecution of human rights defenders, other members of civil society, such as journalists, for their online behavior. Of course, these are all linked. One often feeds into another. Surveillance can lead to arbitrary detention. Blocking of content can prevent exposure that leads to accountability for offline human rights abuses and so forth. I mean, these are not things that any of us are strangers to discussing or hearing about. But I do think that it's important within the context of discussing digital authoritarianism broadly, surveillance itself, and the impact that it can have on press freedoms and other members of civil society, to keep in mind the interconnectedness of these tools of abuse, the correlation, the interconnectedness of all human rights, the interconnectedness of the abuses and the repression that states perpetrate. So there's different ways of thinking about surveillance. Noting some of it is more targeted, such as wiretapping, phishing, spyware, really directing those acts towards a specific individual. Another form in the public space, greater use of facial recognition technology, smart policing, CCTV cameras, things like that. And then this third form, and of course, we could think about this in many other more detailed, more granular ways. This is not an exhaustive breakdown, obviously, but the third form, and this is what I will talk about most, is these issues around sort of network surveillance, or the laws and regulations that fellow panelists have also mentioned, where states, the governments, the various ministries are increasingly putting out and implementing laws and regulations that impose what may seem to be more innocuous requirements on telecommunication providers, infrastructure, ISPs, and others to perform certain tasks, often in the name of, again, as colleagues have said, national security, countering terrorism, broadly speaking, under the narrative of digital sovereignty. But in fact, a lot of these laws and regulations both do not adhere to the state's obligations under international human rights law. They're often vague, they're overbroad, and they raise serious concerns of rights, invasions in the right to privacy, otherwise amounting to surveillance. As Mikhail mentioned, and as I'm sure that many of us are familiar with, international human rights law establishing protection for the right to privacy and freedom of expression, they're not absolute. There are extremely limited circumstances in which these rights can be curtailed, but they have to adhere to what is called the three-part test, which I'll get to in a moment. But I think what's also worth keeping in mind is the conversation around encryption, right to anonymity, the access to circumvention tools, obviously is part of the larger conversation around surveillance, protecting oneself from the state's overreach. And whereas international human rights law is not yet at a point where it has taken a concrete stance on these types of tools, David Kaye, the former special rapporteur on the freedom of expression, in a 2015 report, at least has been quite clear of the importance of encryption or anonymity tools in protecting the rights to freedom of expression, protecting obviously the right to privacy, and that the arbitrary or unlawful interference in regulating such tools can then amount to violations of the right to privacy and expression. And again, this is an area that we see increasingly, not just in the region, but around the world, where in the name of national security, in the name of some kind of dealing with cybercrime or cybersecurity, cracking down on the tools for encryption, anonymity, or circumvention. So what is the three-part test? Broadly speaking, this requires any regulation, any law that might curtail the human rights to freedom of expression, right to privacy, and others, that it must be formulated with precision enough so that anyone can regulate their conduct accordingly. In other words, it cannot be vague or overbroad. Oftentimes with the types of laws and regulations that we see that lead to surveillance, they're unclear, they're vague intentionally because they're drafted by a state that presumably has drafted them in order to give themselves the appearance of legal cover to restrict the rights of their citizens. And so they want them to be vague. They want them to be, able to apply them in, any way that they see fit, which then fails to adhere to their obligations under international law and standards. They must be in pursuit of legitimate aim. While this does allow for some limited restrictions on access to information or freedom of expression in the interest of national security or public order, there's a wide amount of literature, analysis, and explanations from independent experts, the UN and others, that really points to this being a very precise, limited scope. States that use national security as a justification for limiting the rights of their citizens often do so outside of the permissible range of this element, and again, not in compliance with the three-part test, or otherwise, not to be seen as a legitimate aim. And finally, again, as Mikhail said, it must be necessary and proportionate. The tailored, least intrusive means capable, which means that it cannot be broadly applied. It cannot be extensive to an unbounded period of time. It must not be overbroad. And again, in a lot of the laws and regulations that we see across the region and across the world, unfortunately, the movement is towards imposing restrictions, imposing requirements on private companies that do amount to extremely overbroad, that are nowhere near the type of tailored or least intrusive means permissible under international law. And so the reason that I'm kind of going into this in a little bit more detail is also to get to the point of what can be done, what we can do. And I think that it's important that we examine, that we take on any of the laws, policies, regulations that states impose, or the restrictions, requirements that they pose on private companies, and we apply, the strictest interpretation of international human rights law in assessing them, and then holding states accountable. Article 19 is a human rights organization, and so this is generally where we start from. We start from understanding what is the international human rights legal framework saying about a particular issue, apply the analysis, and move forward from there. And so finally, in terms of this concept of beginning from the international frameworks, I would also just like to give a hat tip to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is not hard law. This is not a convention imposing strict legal requirements on companies. It's soft law. It's guidance. It's the best guidance that we have really to date, although there's a lot of efforts underway now to make it more specific, more nuanced, and to provide companies with better guidance and principles on how to adhere to their corporate responsibilities to respect human rights. And why this is important in particular is that so many of the laws and regulations that digital authoritarian states are pushing through, they are putting pressure on private actors, and not exclusively, of course, because in various state contexts, from Vietnam to Myanmar, others in the region, the telecommunication infrastructure providers are essentially extensions of the state, whether they're state-owned enterprises or the state relevant ministries has such control over them that they really would not fall into a category of private sector, but still largely these regulations impose a burden on companies to really call into question what their responsibilities are to respect human rights. And again, this creates an opening for advocacy. This creates an opening for where we can push back. Doing advocacy with an authoritarian state actor is always important, but perhaps there are fewer points of leverage than working with companies that are registered in ostensibly rule of law democratic countries, and working also with the host country governments to find better human rights grounded regulatory frameworks for their companies operating in these contexts, to ensure that they are not then parties to human rights abuse in countries where the governments are pushing through laws and regulations that would otherwise call upon them to be complicit in such abuses. As I mentioned before, there's this narrative on digital sovereignty. Some people have pointed to China, Russia as sort of the thought leaders of this particular concept. I pose whether we think of digital sovereignty or digital authoritarianism. Oftentimes when a government begins to talk of issues of digital sovereignty, they're couching their internet governance, they're couching their data governance around the perspective of the state and not of the individual. They're couching it in narratives of digital sovereignty rather than adherence to international human rights adherence, rather than protection of individual privacy and so forth. Some of the types of laws and regulations that we've seen across the region that fall into this category are areas requiring data localization or requiring electronic service providers, companies, social media platforms, and others to store the data of its citizens, to store the data of users based in the country, various differences, but generally it comes down to storing certain required amounts of data at either data centers in the country. This got a lot of attention in China, for example, where Apple was pressured to move the Apple ID information for all of the Chinese Apple ID holders to data centers in China. First, Apple tried to allay concerns of surveillance, right to privacy violations that would come with this by saying that Apple would still maintain the decryption keys outside of the country to prevent against the type of potentially privacy invading access of local authorities. This was in 2016-17, but almost immediately after establishing the data center, Apple then announced that they had caved and provided the same decryption keys to access the same information to the authorities in the country. And so while we look at the types of data localization laws in the region, questions we need to be asking ourselves and understanding the nuance and how concerned they are is in terms of not only what information is stored in the country, how it is protected, how it is accessible, who has access, and in particular, as international standards would dictate, where authorities, law enforcement, or other representatives of the state may require access to this type of information. It must be limited, it must be specific, but it must in all cases come from with a judicial authority, some sort of court order or something. And oftentimes the laws that we're seeing are not only requiring companies to store user information in the country, they're also granting representatives of different ministries with the authority to demand access to that information from the companies, from the platforms, which is certainly a breach of international standards and raises very serious concerns, again, around protection of privacy and intrusion. Some of the other things that we've seen that relate to this are requirements to appoint local contact persons. This is a representative of foreign technology companies to be either physically based in the country or at least to be the contact point for state authorities when seeking, again, access to the type of information that the companies are then required under national law to provide. Increasingly, this raises concerns around questions of liability, questions around protections for those individuals. Again, the special procedures, the independent experts of the UN have said that certain registration requirements can amount to an infringement on freedom of expression and therefore also must adhere to the tests of necessity and proportionality and so forth. And we should apply that same level of analysis and concern when we see states imposing laws or regulations that require foreign companies to designate contact persons, especially where they must have a registered entity in the country that's accessible and open to liability, whether it's financial or criminal liability. In India, for example, under the Telecommunications Act in India, government there has threatened Twitter executives responsible for, in the eyes of the Indian government, failing to take down content. They have been threatened with up to 5 years imprisonment. And so we've seen across the region how states have used these types of data localization regulations and laws to force companies to move user data into the country physically stored in data centers on the network infrastructure in the country, to either provide it so that it's decryptable with the decryption keys being in possession of the authorities, or designating individuals for those companies to provide access to state authorities when it's requested, even without any type of court order or judicial authority. And in many cases, that can also be a request that authorities make without the expectation of making it public to the individual whose information, whose user data or traffic logs authorities are asking for. What we'll see is the sort of gag orders that are put in place, where companies are not even allowed then to tell users that the state has asked for this type of information. Another is, and our colleague from Philippines mentioned SIM card registration concerns there. We see this across the region, whether it's registering SIM cards or the IMEI number, which is the identification of the physical device, your physical phone. In particular, this was an issue in Myanmar that got a lot of attention earlier this year. In terms of evading censorship, sort of digital security tactic that some have employed in certain contexts, especially where real name registration of SIM cards is imposed, you can get virtual numbers or eSIMs and things like this, which is a helpful way to get around some of the sort of surveillance that comes with a SIM card tied to an identity of an individual. But this breaks down as a useful tactic somewhat when your phone itself is then identifiable through IMEI registration, for example. It becomes more challenging, of course, when local laws require not only SIM cards are registered under a real name, but also imposing identity verification requirements on social media platforms or other providers. And finally, as I mentioned a moment ago, such issues of criminalizing or regulating to a degree that effectively makes encryption or circumvention tools inaccessible. In some countries in the region, China, for example, what we see is that circumvention tools are all but criminalized except for those that are pre-approved by the authorities. So these would not be encryption tools that would be acceptable or recommended to journalists or other members of civil society for lack of guaranteed anonymity and protection. Anyone using unauthorized circumvention tools potentially face up to 5 years imprisonment in China for distributing them. And across the region, we see other similar attempts to regulate or potentially criminalize the use of circumvention or encryption tools, again, in the name of national security, countering mis or disinformation or hate speech. In India, for example, there are efforts underway to require traceability of social media messaging. The only way that this could happen technically is to do away with the end-to-end encryption that the targeted social media platforms or messaging platforms rely on for protection of a right to privacy. So across the region, under this guise of enforcing online safety or national security or countering various forms of cybercrime or using digital regulation to address sort of the physical criminality of other forms of terrorism or something, it's pushing more and more laws and regulations that are leading to the evisceration of the types of protections required to keep you safe, to keep you anonymous, to access information beyond censorship and so forth. Another are the sort of implementation of lawful intercept technologies. This has been a huge issue in Myanmar, but other countries as well in the region, where the authorities have forced telecommunication companies or internet service providers and others to install intermediary devices to capture communications that are processing or flowing through their networks. Again, this can be tied not just to laws and regulations, but to licensing agreements, to MOUs that are signed. It is hard for a company that is providing services in a country to refuse orders of this nature when it's tied to their licensing agreement. They're held hostage. If they don't comply, the authorities may, threaten to kick them out of the country. Again, this is why we need to look through, a multi-stakeholder, multilateral lens from not only the laws, regulations in the country, but then also of the companies operating in those countries and improving international guidelines and principles on how they can adhere to their international commitments, and also regulations in home countries. A much better understanding and human rights grounded global regulatory framework on the role of technology companies in authoritarian countries in particular is needed throughout all of this, of course. And finally, I list network interference again here. As you might recall, I listed this under the sort of tools and tactics of digital authoritarianism. And I only added again here because, again, as we've seen in Myanmar under the Telecommunications Act there and others in the region, including in Thailand, particularly in Indonesia, governments have perpetrated internet shutdowns, as Mikhail mentioned, but these are based on certain provisions within domestic laws that grant the authorities sort of the ability to shut down the internet in the name of some type of telecommunication crime or national security and so forth. Well, one of the other issues with this that touches directly on censorship, which touches directly on surveillance, which touches directly on the role of an independent media, particularly in cases of conflict or gross human rights abuses, whether it's police in the streets committing abuses or atrocity crimes in villages from Rakhine State to Papua. An internet shutdown, of course, blocks the ability to document and disseminate that information on the internet globally, but also when the internet is shut down, people are often then forced to rely on less secure, lower bandwidth 2G technologies, SMS messaging, for example, which is impossible really to protect against the intrusion or eavesdropping from authorities. So not only do internet shutdowns allowed under certain national frameworks that are, again, themselves not in adherence to international norms, not only are they leading to these types of network interference and lack of connectivity issues, they also impose really serious censorship and right to privacy concerns as well. And finally, just a few examples, although I may have already mentioned some of them. In Indonesia, in the last couple of years, has really taken a pretty concerning move towards digital authoritarianism, particularly under Ministerial Regulation 5 and 10 of the Ministry of Information Communication Technologies, which, among other things, require the types of data localization that I outlined, the concerns there I mentioned, mandating that user data be accessible by the authorities. And in this case, again, not in all of these cases does it require judicial authority or court orders. The Philippines, again, as we've heard, requirements for real name registration of SIM cards and social media accounts. Thailand, a colleague already went through so many of these, but again, through the CCA or ministerial notifications under the CCA in the last year, really the Ministry of Digital Economy and Society has extended these types of concerns, putting greater requirements on various companies and platforms to maintain traffic logs, and in particular, imposing tighter user identity verification requirements. And in Vietnam, which has a cybersecurity law that is very closely aligned with the Chinese cybersecurity law, which has been talked about in many contexts as the sort of inspiration for the deterioration of digital rights and internet freedom through manipulating cybersecurity terminology. In Vietnam, tech companies are required to store user data domestically and to actively monitor and censor content. So all of these are based, again, on laws and regulations in these country contexts that we could go on probably every country in the region and name at least one that is problematic. These are a few examples, and definitely we can get into talking about all of them in more detail in the question period. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for that really extensive presentation. I really picked up on the point on the importance of applying the human rights, how we need to apply human rights principles in laws implementation, how we monitor big techs, and yeah, all of these things. So thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, with that being said, we're going to be moving on to the Q&A session. I'd like to open the floor to ask questions to our panelists, and then I will just interject here and there with some of the questions that I have as well. So yes, if you have any questions, you may raise your hand and someone will pass you a mic.
Okay, hi, I'm Fabrina. They said that the committee should not asking question, but sorry about that. I'm just curious because we talk about this digital authoritarianism and also state control platform, and etc. etc. And in civil society, our colleagues from other civil society that works on digital rights, they also concerned about hate narrative, hate speech, and also misinformation. And then they're thinking about how to control platform and involving the government to do so. And then how to regulate them and then ask their responsibility through the government. And then you already mentioned about those regulation in Indonesia, in Thailand, in the Philippines, that controlling is not really a solution. It's then increasing the authoritarianism, the surveillance, the censorship from the government. And yeah, I just want to hear what do you think about that and how we really regulate that with I don't know, but not limiting our freedom of expression, freedom of information as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabrina. I guess I will pass them. Maybe take one question by one, or
okay.
or yes, okay, yeah, we can have one more.
Thank you. I'm Ade. I'm from Legal Aid Center for the Press, Indonesia. Thank you for the speakers. I will talk really practically, like in many cases, digital attack to journalists, like hacking, DDoS, doxing, and else. We cannot find out the perpetrator because many of them anonymous. When we report to the police, the process is very slow. And we just guess the perpetrator is from government, like that. And is there any best experience or from Malaysia or Thailand or any else, how to handle like this case or resolve like this case, like that? Okay, thank you.
Do we have any more? Do we have any questions virtually? Not yet. All right. Okay. So the first question on concern regarding hate speech and disinformation, the roles of platforms and governments and laws, from Fabrina. I guess I'm going to pass this on to Mikkel. Yes, and then the other panelists
Yes.
may add on as well later.
Yeah, I can say something, but I think especially Michael from Article 19 and for sure other colleagues might have something to say here. Well, when it comes to the regulation of the online space, as I mentioned before, I mean, the legislation that already protects freedom of expression in the offline should also apply online. Of course, online brings a whole different new dimension to the information ecosystem. And still there is no like a recipe. What is the perfect piece of legislation to regulate the online space? I mean, the best solution, which is a long-term solution, but it requires more and more investment, is really media information literacy. The public needs to learn to understand how the information flows in the online space, how to behave online, and how this whole new online space functions. I mean, I like to compare it like, imagine like hundreds of years ago when information could only travel from mouth to ear. What's the expression in English? Sorry. And suddenly someone, and most of the books, they were only copied by hand. And suddenly we have the press. And suddenly books are printed right and left, and people have all this information around them. Just imagine the shock in that time of having suddenly so much information around and how to handle that information. I mean, that you can translate it of what we are experiencing today. I mean, it took some time until they could develop a sort of framework to regulate that information, and as well for the people to understand how to navigate and manage that amount of information. Of course, it's very clear when it comes to hate speech. Hate speech is very clear that how to prohibit it, but it's not so clear when it comes to false information and fake news, of course. Again, there is not a recipe right now. I would like to refer back to this three-part test. Whenever a piece of legislation that can potentially limit freedom of expression, that's the three-part test that should be applied, and that's how we know if it provides enough guarantees for freedom of the press and access to information. And again, this is a debate, it's an ongoing debate, and what is really important whenever different countries are developing legislation is really to involve all stakeholders. If not, those pieces of legislation would not have the necessary legitimacy and protections and guarantees. So I would end it here.
Yeah, I guess since you brought up the point on the three-part test, maybe we can revert to Michael to answer the question as well. Michael?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. So, I mean, as Mikhail said, it's definitely challenging because there is no international definition of hate speech. What we can base our analysis, our advocacy, our engagement with states on, again, is the three-part test. We can look at whether or not the laws or policies or regulations from the state adhere to their obligations and international human rights law for those reasons that we outlined. But again, there's also something to be said for the role of tech companies, the role of social media platforms, who are not bound by international law in the way that governments are. That's why I mentioned the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which include a number of sort of responsibilities on the private sector to prevent or mitigate human rights abuses related to their operations, their products, their services, and so forth. This includes doing human rights impact assessments, not only before a given entry into a country or before something, but ongoing human rights assessment and due diligence of their platform operations, their policies in a given context, and doing so transparently, doing so based on feedback and consultation with relevant stakeholders and so on and so forth. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen a lot of to date are social media platforms that are conducting an exercise that they call a human rights impact assessment, but that is often not done in a way that many have argued would live up to the effect of a human rights impact assessment. They're not made transparent in the end. In some famous examples lately, certain platforms have not even released them at all. Oftentimes they're heavily redacted. And so this raises real questions about the policies that these platforms have. Some of the constant challenges have been, you can't talk about hate speech if you don't have cultural and linguistic expertise in a given context, because a word that might mean something innocuous in one sentence can mean something incredibly derogatory or inciting of violence in another sentence. And without the type of cultural or linguistic expertise, you can't really then put together a policy or a decision on regulating that type of speech in an effective way. There are a few other, just to be responsible to the time, I'll just throw out a few other things quickly, but there's a few other pieces of sort of international standards or norms or principles that can also help here. The Santa Clara Principles on Content Moderation, which basically requires companies to release the numbers in terms of content that they're taking down, to issue notice to people whose content is taken down, and to apply to make appeal possible. And really, this is about transparency. This is about accountability of platforms for content that is taken down, but also content that's left up, and ensuring that there is just greater transparency and sort of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder buy-in to the decisions the platforms are making in terms of a really sensitive and human rights grounded approach to regulating harmful content on their platforms. We could have a whole panel, we could have a whole conference about all of this, obviously, so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay, cool.
Okay, thank you so much. Right. So I recently watched this YouTube clip of Maria Ressa appearing on The Late Show of Stephen Colbert, where she perfectly basically summed up how deeply involved social media platforms are when it comes to the proliferation of misinformation and hate speech online, in the case of Philippines at the very least. And so it's true that in this context, both governments and tech companies are responsible. So just, right now what we're seeing is on the government side, they are in charge of issuing laws or policies that regulate how information is to be shared and received online. On the tech companies side, there is a very clear case of how abrasive or inflammatory content is much more prone to being shared and reshared on these platforms. So for instance, there was a study back in 2020 that shows how false content or misinformation on Facebook actually got 6 times more clicks than factual content that's well-grounded in fact. So this shows just how easily it is for social media companies to essentially create or facilitate the spread of this misinformation, because of course more clicks mean more money. I agree with what Michael said earlier. I think that in order to properly regulate this, we need to sort of see first the transparency duties of tech companies. And in my opinion, it's necessary to see transparency as a multifaceted obligation. So, number one, we need to first, and this is also something that might serve as a blueprint for future regulation in this regard. So there's transparency and moderation. So, for instance, these would entail the questions of how would problematic content be flagged for potential disinformation or hate speech? Is it done manually? Is it partially automated? Is it fully automated? How is flagged content that's already flagged, prioritized for review and for moderation? And who does this affect? Is the impact disproportionate against a certain groups, for instance? There also needs to be transparency regarding the policies that are set up by tech companies. So companies need to have a very clear policy in terms of how they moderate content related to different themes, different topics. So content in education, content in politics, content in commerce. How are these managed on their platforms? Are these policies enforced consistently across cases? Are there appeals mechanisms available for people that have been subjected to moderation? And of course, there also needs to be transparency regarding the appeals that have been granted or rejected in the past, so that could be used as a point of reference for future cases that are of similar nature. And then there's also the third type of transparency, which is transparency regarding the personnel in charge of moderation. So this is something that Michael also touched upon. Companies need to explain whether, number one, there's sufficient staffing to handle the amount of content that needs to be tracked on their platforms. Are these moderators even aware of the subtle linguistic, cultural, political context of the content in question when it's not in English, for instance? So these are all factors that tech companies must consider, I think, going forward, as well as regulators in terms of designing the proper regulation that would target the issues that we're discussing. Thank you.
Thanks. How about Rowan and Joanna? Do you have anything to add?
Okay. So, yeah, I totally agree with Mikel's point that it's the long-term solution for about this surveillance and the proliferation of fake news, etc., or the usage of internet in general is media information and literacy, especially us in the Philippines. Like we have to do so much work to address this issue. And us in NUJP, we actually believe that it's what's happening on social media is the reflection of the kind of society that we have. So if your society is corrupt, then it will reflect on social media. So, the government should basically educate its people. So if you don't educate its people, that's what you'll get, like fake news and propaganda. And, and our new president, Bongbong Marcos, capitalized greatly on that gap, no? So we have to do so much work on media information and literacy. And of course, international organizations, or like especially the Western governments and other governments in general and funders, they should fund these efforts also, to make it more sustainable, to make it, very more effective in general. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Mikel and Joanna's point about media information literacy. And I also I also agree with Michael's points on the use of language and what constitutes as hate speech. I guess, Fabrina, to answer a little bit, because CIJ had actually conducted a social media monitoring project during our elections last month. We also worked together with Jom Chek, Imran over here, who did some work on fact checking. That's with regards to disinformation. But for our project, we actually looked into hate speech and how that is amplified during elections and targets certain communities. And we've noticed that language was such a huge, interesting, intricate part to look into, because there is no one word that could stand that we thought that we knew English, and we thought that we knew Malaysian English and we thought that we knew Malay, but that was completely thrown out of the window when we started this project, because all kinds of new derogatory words were coming up. So yes, media info literacy is definitely needed in this aspect. Yeah, so I guess, like Michael said, this topic should be a whole entire conference by its own. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the second question by Ade, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Okay, so on digital attack to journalists, usually it cannot be pinpointed on one person because it's done anonymously, and usually it comes from authorities and the government. Is that something that you're just guessing? Okay. All right. Assuming on that. Okay. So your question is, how do you proceed into looking into that further, and how do you find a solution in that? Is that the question? Okay, the best experience in sharing. I think, yes, I think Joanna is the perfect person to talk about this.
Thank you. We have so much to share, but I'll keep it short. I think the best practice that we have in the Philippines is the ones practiced by Bulatlat. No? So they were attacked. So they had DDoS attack, like persistently. So since 2018 up until September 2022, they were DDoSed. They have been DDoSed. So, and also they eventually their website has been blocked by the government. So it's one of the last efforts of the Duterte administration, or one of the last attacks under the Duterte administration. So what they did with the DDoS attack is they partnered with Curium to do like forensic analysis. So Curium is I'm not sure if everyone's familiar about Curium, but it's a Swedish-based organization that conducts forensic analysis and, you know, advocates for digital rights too. So they're a team of techies, no, who have been working with non-government organizations and the civil society. So what they did was they did the forensic analysis. The latest result, so they've been working with Bulatlat since 2018. So the latest result, or the latest DDoS against Bulatlat, they found out that it was carried out by the Philippine Army. So the IP address, they've traced the IP address to the Philippine Army. So from the Department of Science and Technology, who owns the IP address, they traced it to the Philippine Army and a private organization or private corporation that carried out the attack. So what they did was they filed a case against this private organization because it's them who carried out the attack. And so it's like they launched the attack under the IP address of the Philippine Army. So what they won the case. So first they collaborated, then second they filed legal case, like a counterattack. So that's one. That's two, actually. The second is as for the DNS blocking, what they did was they filed a counterattack to against the government. It's the National Security Council who tagged them, who branded them as a website aiding communist rebels, basically. So that's what they did. They filed a case, and then the court allowed them to, or the court ordered the National Telecommunications Commission to unblock the website. But it's they had to file like 100,000 pesos, like $2,000 bail or bond to the court. So that's what happened. So first, I think collaboration is really important. So collaboration and solidarity with other organizations. And second, I think it's more of the legal side of it. You know, like launching campaigns and counter attacks against these people who carry out the attacks against us. So it's like fighting back. So there.
That case is a pretty special case. Curium does, I think they did about 5 investigations globally last year. Another excellent investigation was done by Bellingcat in Papua, and they found a whole lot of disinformation and they tracked where the sources are. But I hate to tell you, it's not going to happen to every case. They have to be spectacular cases to take on. So there's a bigger problem that the social media platforms, they can do a lot of this. And I think, you know, what we can do, and you know, us in this room and us listening in, what can we do? We can put more pressure through our media and through our journalism and our media development work on the platforms. You were talking about Malaysia and hate speech. If you were one of the media platform, a media outlet, and published hate speech that we see currently on tech platforms, you would be sued and you would be deregistered. So I'm not necessarily saying we have to go to those extent with platforms, but we do need to put their feet to the fire to hold them accountable to their community standards. And that we can do as people in this room.
Michael, Mikkel, and Felicity, would you like to add on to that? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the both of you really brought up some very interesting points. With regards to the cases that you've shared, Joanna, I think it also states how important access to information is in digital, how we use our digital space. But I guess the other thing is, yes, with Rowan, putting the onus on the platforms to follow their community guidelines. Do you think that all of these platforms have their community guidelines are comprehensive enough in order to, you know, address hate speech, disinformation, and such?
I'm not asking them to be comprehensive enough to stop disinformation or hate speech. I'm actually asking that they actually adhere to the guidelines that they've set up. They're wholly imperfect currently, but they don't adhere to that. So let's at least get them to that point.
No, thank you. I mean, in some cases, these community standards even go a bit beyond of what international standards are. I don't know in other languages, of course, but in Spanish, for example, I follow a number of women activists, feminists. Well, when they use Instagram, which is right now Instagram or TikTok, which are their main platforms where they try to raise awareness on issues related to gender equality, well, they had to stop using words like rape, for example, and rapist, because the algorithm automatically deletes the video right away because understands that is incitement or just, and they are trying to do exactly the opposite, right? They are trying to raise awareness on these issues. So sometimes the community standards or the algorithm that they have set up, in TikTok, I know for sure that that is what happens. They delete automatically whichever content that includes those words, and related to race and religion, it happens as well. And I think that Instagram is also going into that direction. And that's not the solution neither. Of course, it's more cost efficient for them because then the content gets removed right away through their algorithm filters, but that is not really the solution. And what we were discussing, there needs to be more accountability from these companies. And I mean, the discourse that we always hear is like, we provide the platform, we are not responsible for the content. Well, the same way, when cars are involved in a car accident, yes, the car builder, they create the car, but also they include some safety features on it, So all the responsibility is not for the person who is driving the car. It is also for the one who builds that platform, that car, and also for the different countries that impose certain legislation for the car builder to apply it in building the car. So we can translate somehow this same argument to the digital platforms. And really, I mean, I think it's important that it's not that I'm doing publicity about my organization, but this conference in February that UNESCO is organizing, and for the first time there will be a debate globally around how to legislate or regulate the internet media. I really encourage all of you, if you cannot be there in person, really to participate online, and because this is the beginning of an area of work that UNESCO and the UN will be more involved in the years to come. So I think it is very important that we are all part of this and we understand the issues that are being discussed, so that we can better do the advocacy in our countries.
Yeah, the point about algorithms is definitely a vicious cycle and something that we have to pay attention to. Because if I remember correctly, a Malaysian journalist noted at a CIJ event earlier this year on International Day for Universal Access to Information forum, that big techs use algorithms to shape content and influence its users. So media outlets have to rethink about their business models on, like how do they figure out which stories would sell online? Would that go against certain community guidelines? Would that amplify more hate speech? I guess it's a really vicious cycle. So I just wanted to double check with Ade if he is all right with the answer, but I guess he's not here. Do we have any other questions from the floor?
Can I just jump in and add a little on top of the last comment, if that's okay?
Yes, of course, Michael.
Yeah, just a few other comments on the topic of algorithms, and reiterating some of the things that we've, a number of us have already said, obviously also in terms of the importance of transparency. these companies treat their algorithms as proprietary information, which up to a certain point is understandable. It's their intellectual property. However, when the lack of transparency on this IP leads to a state where there is no real avenue for independent evaluation or assessment of how they are fueling incitement or promoting misinformation or hate speech and so forth, then it really does obviously become a serious problem. And so in line with everything we've been saying earlier about the importance of transparency, again, really in terms of the algorithms, this is another area where it's of high importance for there to be transparency, for independent external auditing and evaluation of the different algorithms that different companies are using. And that doesn't mean that it has to be something that's suddenly publicly available to everybody on the planet, but there should be a trusted third-party, fully independent sort of community or committee that does have the ability for regular auditing and assessment of the algorithms that these platforms are using. And secondly, where we've seen, and I, Michaela just made this comment as well, that relying more on sort of automated content moderation from platforms to deal with the real problem of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, harmful content, and so forth, does mean that not only does a lot of the time legitimate, expression, or certainly it seems largely it's in conversations where women's rights or minority rights in marginalized communities are using vocabulary to defend their rights, not necessarily to the point of re-signifying it, but using this vocabulary to document or talk about rights abuses, and then their speech is being censored because of those reasons. But also what we see is through either the shadow banning of this content that can be then manipulated intentionally by malicious actors from state-backed sort of bot or trolls and so forth, where you have suddenly flooding of inauthentic fake accounts pushing certain narratives using the hashtags or the vocabulary that human rights organizations are using for campaigning or documentation purpose, with the intention of triggering those automated misinformation or other sort of filtering systems on platforms to lead to what in effect is censorship of content without having to go to the full extent of issuing a full notice and takedown order of those platforms. And again, this then goes back to where a better implementation of Santa Clara principles and others in terms of transparency comes from, is that while some platforms are moving in the direction of being public about how many pieces of content they remove, there is really not the same type of effort underway in terms of how much content is demoted, for example, within the search algorithms or timelines and so forth. And so also working to understand whether you have notice, whether you have documentation, how pieces of content is demoted, because if you don't know your campaign has been demoted because it's been triggered by one of these sort of automated filtering systems, obviously you can't then raise a concern or an appeal with the platforms either.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, that you brought up a really important point, and it brings back memories of our social media monitoring project for elections by CIJ that I mentioned earlier. Just wanted to ask if we have any questions from the floor. Yes, I see Imran with his hands up. Also, do we have any questions from our participants online? All right, cool.
Hi, I'm Imran. I'm from Gram. I also participate in a Jom Check initiative in Malaysia, where we have just finished election and would like to share some of our experience. I totally agree with the idea of media or tech companies have to work on language-based, effort on combating misinformation. And there's also, when we talk about algorithm, there's also age issue, because we have not spoken about age yet. We spoke a lot about language and also the algorithm, but age is also something that we need to consider, because sometimes the algorithm and people around this room, we are absolutely more than 20 years old. So the algorithm that comes and the content that comes to us can be different compared to people that is younger than us. In the recent election, prior election, we had a briefing from TikTok, and they said they have already prepared actions facing election, especially where they claim to have a Malay speaker or Malay language content moderator. But post-election, we found out that there's a lot of fear mongering, and also of course dangerous speech going on TikTok, and some of them and many of them are actually using the hashtag of ditaja, meaning to say sponsored. So somebody is behind this and sponsoring youth to put on contents that triggers racial sentiments when it comes to election. So but sadly we only discover this after election. There's nothing much we can do about it. And after that, TikTok managed to basically, after pressure, I guess, took down some of the contents. Some of them could still be up there, but yeah, it is after election. There's nothing much you can do. So that's all I want to add. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Imran. Do we have any other questions from the floor? No, we're all good. Okay, I'm going to, before we end, I'm going to pass the mic on to each of the speakers to just give your final remarks for the key points you've made during the panel discussion. Yeah, we can start with Joanna.
Okay, I have nothing much to say because I've already made some points, but I think it's this conference is very helpful for us to, as an avenue for us to collaborate further, especially in the region. So I think we should have more discussions, have more collaboration in terms of the digital rights aspect, so that, because we have so many things in common. What you've just mentioned about the TikTok thing, I think it's very similar to what's happening in the Philippines. So I'm just going to share something, but it's the Marcos team actually capitalized heavily on TikTok, and the ones that gained more traction was the misinformation about this administration or this family, the Marcos family. Those absurd claims that Marcos Sr. or the late Marcos, late dictator Marcos was a recipient of gold bars, many like a humongous set of gold bars from a legendary family. So, these things actually are very similar. We face very similar situations. So I think it's really best for us to collaborate, for us to forge solidarity, so that whenever something happens, we actually appreciate the statements of support, especially us in NUJP. We appreciate the support given to us by AGI and other Southeast Asian organizations. So I think that's my last point. Thank you.
I just totally agree with what Joanna said. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. The more we can share ideas amongst ourselves, the better that it will be for all of us, because, the bad guys are doing it.
Well, still on the point of collaboration, I think it's absolutely great when journalists team up on the basis of, the adversities that they share, the lived experiences that they have in common. Manusha Foundation is not a journalism-based organization. What we do is we document rights abuses. We issue reports on contemporary developments in how governments regulate the internet across Southeast Asia. And so I would just like to quickly note that it's also possible that collaboration is done with organizations such as Manusha, because we do have the capabilities to look into the specific laws, the specific policies that are being used against press freedom in Southeast Asian jurisdictions. So right now we have a Stop Digital Dictatorship campaign that have been going around social media for a while. Our ASEAN Regional Coalition to Stop Digital Dictatorship is currently also expanding. One of our members is Foundation for Media Alternatives in the Philippines, and we are hoping that in the future, more journalist associations or journalism-based organizations, nonprofits, could also join us to help us identify what other challenges in press freedom have not been properly addressed, and what can we do about it?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I just think that what is happening here today is really meaningful. I mean, since SIPA kind of disappeared in thin air, this solidarity between journalists in the region, and not only journalists, but also organizations working on human rights issues, this solidarity is very much needed. The threats are very similar, and the solidarity should be even stronger in this context, especially for, it's a very diverse region. And we can really learn from each other a lot. Recently, Malaysia, Philippines went through their elections. Cambodia, we are going through the elections in 2023. For sure, some of the issues that already happened in both Philippines and Malaysia might happen as well here. So this is really the time for our Cambodian colleagues to learn and to get ready for what might happen in July next year. So this collaboration is really needed, and is not an empty word, as we tend to say so often that we need to collaborate more. There are certain topics, issues where really working together can really make an impact, like when dealing with the big tech companies like Facebook, like TikTok. I think that we really need to be in a strong position to demand the accountability, the transparency that they owe the users and that they owe the democratic systems in which they work. And for countries that are smaller, to get that accountability and to demand that is more difficult, but collectively that work can be done much more easily. So I just thank you for letting me be part of this, and I really hope that this conference can lead into something really positive and impactful. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to give your final remarks before we end the session?
Sure, thank you. And I'll just, reiterate what everyone has said, and sort of acknowledging the power of solidarity and coalition, especially as Rowan said. I mean, the human rights abusers, the authoritarian states in the region are certainly working together to model their laws, to model their tools of oppression, learning from each other. And I mean, we as global civil society, whether we're independent journalists, whether we're lawyers or other human rights defenders, also can learn from this, and strengthening our solidarity and our coalitions. Article 19 has a regional coalition called the Internet Freedom Initiative, which has partners and activities in a number of countries in Southeast Asia, and in relation to some actions in East Asia as well. So, I mean, if anyone is interested in learning more about what Article 19 is doing in the region, please reach out. My email was on the PowerPoints, and you can get it from the organizers. Happy to talk further. And to just sort of end with, again, reiterating the importance of transparency, particularly where I think we as civil society have a greater potential impact is in working with technology companies registered in otherwise rule of law, democracy respecting countries. So demanding transparency, demanding accountability, and pushing for more openness to communication and engagement with civil society, and in all things where whether it's from legislation at the national level or policies at the sort of private sector level, always pushing for multi-stakeholderism. Governments alone cannot be setting the standards that govern the internet. Should be all representatives of civil society from multiple backgrounds. And I mean, it's really important that we move forward in that way. And thanks so much to the organizers too. This was a great conversation.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Okay, so our session has come to an end. On the note of collaboration, I guess multi-stakeholder collaboration is really key in this. And as we can see, there is still so much more conversation and discussion to be had on this, and so much more work to be done, a lot more research to be done in this area as well. And we really hope that this discussion has inspired all of you to move the conversation forward, to just build a bit more onto this topic. Also, we hope that we have met the expectations, your expectations on this session as well. I'd like to end by thanking the panel of speakers and participants online and offline for contributing to such an engaging and insightful discussion. I'd like to also thank the organizers for putting together such a great session as well. Thank you.
Thank you, the participant, for your attention to the session. Lengthy session, but very useful. Now we are going to have a coffee break, and we will gather back at 4:30 for more the most important session, MOU signing, and also closing. Yep. Thank you.